Conrad, our ancestors, they were terrible people. They robbed, lied, pillaged, and killed until one day they found themselves noblemen. But that nobility, it never came from chivalry. It came from being tough and ruthless. Back then, to be called a gentleman would have been a death sentence, not the mark of honor it is today. We are Oxfords, not rogues.
Hey guys, thanks for tuning in. So today we're going to look at property as an asset class, and quite an interesting speech by Ray Fiennes in The King's Man. It just goes to show the expanding social consciousness of historical logic and rationale. As Winston Churchill so rightly said, history is always written by the victors, and while we believe in this age of the gentleman, the reality is the wealth that was accumulated by previous gentlemen it was accumulated by being far from gentle, right? So it was taken by force. Lands were taken, wars were fought. It's the story of humankind, human history. Now work is of a softer nature, well-paying, in an office, that kind of thing. But back then it was rough and tumble, right? So what if I told you the wealthiest person in the history of the world was black? Would you believe me? Probably not, right? Because all our history books are written in such a way that, we associate wealth with the likes of Musk, Bezos. If you go further back in history, Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, JP Morgan, right? So it's hard to believe that at a certain point in history, a black man could have been, the wealthiest person in the world, let alone the wealthiest person in human history. But there's more than sufficient evidence to indicate that. So the guy you see on the top of your screen, his name is Mansa Musa, and he ruled the Malian Empire for about just over 50 odd years, right? And he was known as the Gold King because he absolutely loved gold, right? So there's a story that when he went to Egypt, he gave them so much of gold, right? So he increased the supply so much that the price of gold fell for over a decade, for over 10 years. Imagine having that much of gold, right? He also annexed 23 cities. Let me just draw this here. So he also annexed 23 to 24 cities to combine them into a land area that is the shape of this penis here, and call that Timbuktu, right? So Timbuktu became the center for global trade. This was back in the 1300s, right? So all of global trade was facilitated through this sort of area right here. That's what made him probably the wealthiest person in history, right? So Forbes, it's very hard for Forbes to estimate, but they do believe that he was wealthier than Julius Caesar, right? So yeah, that's quite interesting. I found that quite interesting, and it goes to show that wealth and property always went hand in hand, right? And it's just the means to acquire property has changed over the years, but yeah, the link has always been there, right? So why is this relevant? I mean, if you take these images here, the horrific riots in KZN about a year ago, in fact, almost exactly a year ago, we went into, our president announced that we were going into another stage of lockdown, and the next day the country started burning, right? Absolutely burning. There were coordinated attacks, so on and so forth. And you contrast that with the image on the top of the developed world and how stable they are in terms of the property market and so on and so forth. So how do we go about solving these issues? How can property help with reducing the level of inequality? Well, let's have a chat. So the right to vote was always a function of property ownership dating back throughout history, right? So we I have some people who tell you that should still be the case, but I mean, we live in a free and fair society now where, whether you're sweeping the streets or you a multi-billionaire, you each get one vote, right? So it's about equality, and everybody is seen as equal. Yeah, and we hear some interesting stats. The president often quotes that 10% of people own 90% of the land. Now, firstly, that's an unverified stat. Secondly, in terms of it's being used to promote a political agenda, because if you look at the UK, for example, if you look at Britain, 189,000 families own two-thirds of the land in Britain, right? That was as at 2016. So that's not a uniquely South African problem. That is a problem that comes with property and generational ownership of property. And yeah, I think we all grew up playing Monopoly. We all grew up believing that, in terms of capitalism, the way to win was to own everything and bleed the other person's cash flow. Whereas, that thinking is fundamentally wrong in terms of capitalism, because in a more stable society, everybody has access to property. Everybody has access to owning a piece of land, that kind of thing, to make them feel part of an inclusive society, right? So that's what we need to strive to do. That's what we need to strive to achieve. Whether we get there in my lifetime or not, probably, is up for debate. But we've got a lot of work to do in that respect, right? And also in terms of the banking and the finance system, it's built around the idea that it's a good idea to lend people who own property money, because you got this mortgage bond, 20 years, where you going to go? The property is now going to appreciate in value. It's going to go up. Your debt is fixed, or from, calculated at day one. Your interest is also capitalized at day one. So, provided you don't go and mortgage again and that kind of stuff, I mean, yeah, it seems like a good idea at face value. So where did this idea come from, actually? So very very interestingly, having a look at the Ford River Rouge protests in 1932, just like a little under 100 years ago, what we experienced in KZN last year wasn't unique, right? So Henry Ford was famous for once saying that, he all he needs is two arms, but he has to pay for the whole body, right? Referring to the workers in that. So he just needed their two arms for productivity, to sort of build these vehicles, but he ended up getting the human dynamic with it, right? Because people get sick, people need leave, people have family responsibility, that kind of thing. And, as a cold-hearted entrepreneur, capitalist, it shows the disconnect between caring about people, the lack of empathy, that kind of thing, right? So this protest got violent, extremely violent, to the effect that, after 5,000 workers were laid off, mass protests began, fires started burning, 5 protesters were shot in the process. And that's when they had their honest look at inequality within their society. And it was actually the Roosevelt government that pioneered this idea that people should own property, people should own a piece of land, people should have a stake in their own country, right? So by doing that, you'd prevent revolutions that had happened in France and all across Europe. So, they were very aware of all these kind of things. So they pioneered the idea of people owning their own property, owning their own land, but they quickly realized that, in terms of finance, how do we go about doing this now? So they created 2 of the biggest known mortgage lenders in America, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. You might remember the names from the global financial crisis. But yeah, the whole idea behind it was that if the state guaranteed finance for people and they purchased a home, it would lead to a more stable, more inclusive society. And that's the major difference between the sort of developed world and the developing world, because here we just believe that people must do everything themselves. The state, even though we're paying the highest percentage of tax to to GDP anywhere in the world, right? We believe that people must just do it because they need to be patriotic. Doesn't work like that, right? Particularly at a higher net worth level, where it's very easy for people to move money offshore, right? So yeah, property is quite an interesting asset class, and it's an asset class that is designed more for growth, more for long-term capital appreciation. When I say long-term, I'm talking 10 to 20 years plus, right? So I always get these questions, is it still good to buy property today? Would I not be better off renting and putting that surplus away and investing it to grow it over time? And it's always depends on the person, their time horizon, their circumstances. So it's best to consult with someone who will guide you through these things and help you make a better financial decision. But yeah, like everything, it always depends on you. It depends on your timing, circumstances, those kind of things. Because if you are a highly skilled professional and your skills are in demand globally, do you really want to be stuck looking after property here? You suddenly need to be on a project somewhere in Africa or internationally. Can you quickly get a tenant for your place? Who's going to look after it? All those things come into consideration when you're looking at property, right? Okay, and now if we get on to the next things in terms of reducing inequality in our society, we need to look at, have our land programs been successful? So this image on the left hand side, you can read through it, but this is a famous image, a famous quote from Nelson Mandela. In fact, if you walk into his capture site in Howick, this is the very first thing that you will see on the display board, right? So he speaks about the African nations living peacefully, being able to move freely about, and these were stories that he was told by his elders. So yeah, it really makes you think in terms of the history of our country and our social dynamics. And part of the reason for that is the 1913 Native Land Act, which essentially prevented African people from owning land. So no matter how wealthy you were, or you were already being oppressed at that time, you were further oppressed legally by not being able to own land. So what did that do? That created the cycle of where wealth was now not able to be passed down from generation to generation. You were destined to just become a slave to the land, basically, right? So what has been done since democracy to sort of remedy this, right? So we've had three land programs in the country. Each have come with its own unique sets of challenges. So land redistribution requires there to be just and equitable redistribution according to the Constitution. Now, the major challenge with that is, who determines what is just and equitable? So a willing buyer, willing seller model proved to be ineffective in this regard, right? You couple that to the fact that food security is primarily linked to redistribution to prevent issues like Zimbabwe, as well as the rest of issues that happen in the rest of Africa. You find that redistribution is very, very difficult to do. It's a brilliant concept on paper, but in execution it's very difficult, right? Then you get land restitution, because although people may have lived on land for generations, it's hard to prove, right, that you've had a title deed, or if you had access to documentary proof of being able to exist on that land. Think about the Ukraine right now, right? So if the Russians invade and suddenly you've got people coming in with guns and tanks and all this stuff, the last thing on your mind is grabbing your passport, grabbing your municipal bills, all these kinds of things, right? You just grab your family, you grab your loved ones, and you run, right? So that's the history of the world, whether we like it or not, whether the media now portrays a spotlight on these areas, but that's been the history of pretty much every nation in the world, right? So land restitution is very, very difficult to do in practice, right? And then you get land tenure. And Carte Blanche actually over the years has heavily focused on land tenure, and there's massive problems with land tenure because you get these massive farms. Now these farms can't look after themselves. You need laborers to tend the soil and do the planting and all these kind of things, maintenance. But by the same token, the farmer also doesn't want the tenant sort of on his land per se, so he gives him a little section where he can keep his goats, cows, whatever. But as a land tenant, he stipulates, he'll say, okay, I can keep 500 cows on my land, you can only keep 5, or you can keep a maximum of 5 goats. Now it becomes very hard for the land tenant to subsist with that criteria and sort of thing, based on the criteria set down by the farmer. And it tends to lead to a lot of animosity and a lot of tension over time, right? So, from all our land programs so far, we haven't found one sustainable solution. And if you look at politics within the country, the EFF is very, very extremist in their policy because, there should be no compensation. The ANC policy is slightly different. There is compensation, but in different forms. So, for example, if they take over a dilapidated building in the CBD, or you've owned this building in the CBD and your rate bill has run into arrears and it's millions and millions of rands, they are willing to write off that debt as a form of compensation, whereas the EFF is more extreme. They're like, no, we want your building, plus we still want you to pay the debt, right? Which helps nobody at the end of the day, right? At the end of the day, if those dilapidated buildings can be converted into things that are highly in demand and needed at the moment, such as, student accommodation, old age homes, frail cares, that kind of thing, it benefits society as a whole, and all stakeholders in society benefit, right? So yeah, thanks for tuning in. That was my take on property. It certainly is a good tool to address wealth inequality. It is something, however, as an asset class that is more long-term in nature, and yeah, it just depends on your time horizon. And next time we'll have a look at equities, we'll have a look at the history of the stock market. And yeah, thanks for tuning in. Take care. Bye.